I approve the agenda.
Yeah. Can I have a second to that motion?
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I have a motion to approve the minutes.
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Can I have a second?
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Stephanie?
Okay. Before we dive into the report, I do want the questions were raised regarding structure, and I want to propose an idea that I think the city would like to follow, is that doing a jointly written report can be cumbersome and very time consuming, you know, trying to meld voices and all that. So I suggest we hired a consultant to do the writing. I would suggest that we let her do the writing, even if her voice is somewhat different. The task force is imperative in making sure the content reflects what you want it to reflect. You know, she's not just going to go off on her own and write some random report regardless of these meetings. But that it'll be, you know, it'll probably reflect her voice. I mean, the recommendations regarding tone and all that, I think, are completely valid. But having multiple editorial hands, I think, could be really challenging, especially if the editorial hands are in conflict with each other. And I think that would be unnecessarily time consuming. So I would propose that we let the consultant team do the writing, comment on content, you know, like we never said that we want to forbid all teardowns, you know, whatever. She's not going to do that. But, you know, some comment on that, but then let her do the writing. She has written multiple reports like this for different task force and organizations. So as far as like the structure, again, you know, having the task force have say, and that we want community drivers to be towards the front. I think that is completely and utterly valid because that reflects some of your priorities. But some of the other things, I think we should allow that to be in the consultant's hands, since that's why we're paying them the big bucks.
Stephanie, can you be specific about what some of the other things might look like?
What do you mean?
Well, you said, I thought that was just a generally broad statement.
Other things.
Specifically to structure.
Oh, structure. Well, the like the table of contents. I know, for instance, Joe, I know that you felt like having an introduction of the task force members shouldn't be at the beginning. And I've read a few task force reports, and I actually have seen, since this is a community-driven task force, I actually have seen that being pretty consistent across the board, where they have either a letter from the chair or some sort of descriptor of the task force. That seems like that's a pretty boilerplate structure.
Well, I guess my comment was, let's not turn this into a boilerplate report. So, and those were kind of my general thoughts. You know, let's get to the meat and potato of the structure of the report, and then add all the stuff we want in appendices, thinking that maybe that will draw more people to read it because it's a concise, to the point report. And people can go, if they have interest in some of the other information, they can find that in the appendices. It would be different, right? It would be different from any of the reports that we have looked at or referenced. So I understand the concern over, I understand that concern.
Right. No, I hear you. Merritt?
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, you just muted yourself.
Oh, wait up. All right, you can hear me on the phone and I won't get a
Yeah.
back echo. Hi. So Stephanie's intro there, thank you, Stephanie, was new to me as well, so I'm processing it with all of you. But something Stephanie and I did talk about yesterday is I think it's hard. It takes a while to hammer through the report with all these different sections, and it is already kind of a different structure than I'm used to. And when we check in once a week, I think I spend too much time trying to figure out how to edit the report in a way that we'll have some sort of discrete thing to talk about that next week. And I think what would be helpful for me at this point is if I could get 2 solid weeks to try to get it into a full draft form. And then we go through comments focusing on kind of what it looks like comprehensively. You know, if there are pieces you feel you want to talk about as a task force that you want to do within a week, you know, hammering through something, that's fine. But as far as it being about kind of the specific content of the report, I kind of want 2 weeks to do that. I also just wanted to say, Joe, that it is, having the acknowledgements is pretty common as the inside of the cover page. So it's something that people almost don't pay attention to in a way because it's just kind of right behind the cover. I don't have a strong feeling about it, but I'm wondering, I just want to ask, do you have any concern about being acknowledged as a task force member up front?
No.
No, I have no personal concern about that whatsoever, but I don't, the report, I think, so my view is when you read things first, right, it tends to lend importance or important to that point or that piece that you're introducing. And this report is not about us, right? And frankly, who do we acknowledge? So it becomes unimportant to me, and it's like stick it in the back. But I don't care. People should know who the task force comprised of. But outside of that, it's unimportant to me personally. Maybe that's just my practicality and whatever, but that is my personal opinion on it.
A couple of things. One, on the listing of the task force members, I agree with Joe. I don't. It's obviously we have to be listed somewhere, otherwise it would raise questions to read it, not know it's there. But and maybe a little cynical in me. Typically, you know, many people want their name up front because they want something else. Excuse me, they want something else out of it rather than just being part of the report. So, however the group does it. On the initial comments that Stephanie made, I've never done something like this, so I don't know how to get to the end. But I am, you know, of the task force members, there's probably no one that disagrees with Merritt more than I do. Yet I am have full confidence in her ability to put something together and we can massage to make it say, first of all, it's going to say multiple things, but sending her down the path to you know, to do 90% of it, I am more than comfortable with.
So Dan, how do we? I support that. I'm trying to. How do we get to the end, right? How do we all have different opinions. We all have different styles. as Merritt, as you're pulling this together, it's starting to synthesize it for me, which is really good, so I can see it holistically. But as I see that, I started to go through and just kind of make notes on the side of, my personal notes. I don't know how to share those appropriately without just throwing the things off the rail, which I don't want to do. But I do have some strong opinions on tone and messaging that I think is really important. So how do we do that?
So let me respond to it first. Because you put the question to me, sir. I don't know how we do it. It's like at times I feel like we're on a life raft, and in addition to not knowing which way to row, there's a leak in the boat. But in my mind, you just keep solving more urgent problems, and so.
That's a great analogy.
But I do feel like things become a little bit clearer every week, and so I'm encouraged too when you consistently say the same things, which is great, and you're like the person on a committee that everyone else is kind of like rolling their eyes going, God, is he going to let it go? And then suddenly you realize, oh my God, now I know what he's talking about. So I appreciate you keep pushing this issue, because if you don't, at the end, a majority of the people in the task force will walk away in the back of their mind thinking, well, it really didn't say what I wanted it to say. So I just think we need to keep slogging through it.
Yes, Norm? Oh, you're mute. Let me unmute you. I had to mute you because there's a lot of background noise.
I wanted to react to your comment, Merritt, that you wanted 2 weeks to work on this. We are in the first week of October, and if I understand it correctly, we were going to have a draft available by the end of October, 3 weeks. From my point of view, I get the best understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and the feeling of all the other task force members through these discussions. And I would not want to go 2 weeks without having one of these meetings where we continue to discuss what we think about the topics that are being written about. So you may want to focus most of your time on your writing, but I would not want to give up a meeting in the intervening week to have a chance to continue to have the discussions like we've been having and we're having today.
Well, on that note, I mean, I hear you, Norm, too, and I have been chastised by my superiors for being an example by allowing us to meet every week. They're like, Stephanie, that's just bad government. But you are not government. So I'm trying to weigh all this.
So I guess I have a comment.
Why don't we plug through? Yeah.
My comment is, I mean, I think I can see both sides. I do see how if I was Merritt, it would be a little frustrating to put a draft or have it picked apart, go try to revise it, put it forward again, have it picked apart. You feel like you can't ever move on to the next section because you have 8 very opinionated editors commenting on every punctuation, word choice, font, size of font, graphic. Hard to move forward with getting so much feedback from people. It's just like she's like trying to drink out of a fire hose. So I do think that we need to respect her efforts and if she needs space, give her space to do her work. And if we want to meet next week, let's not pick Let's talk about something else. Let's give her the time that she needs. We have plenty of topics that we can talk about. Other things, what our presentation might look like to the council. Let's use that time. Let's stay connected, but let's also respect our consultant and not, make her life miserable, which I think perhaps could end up being reflected in the tone of the report. If she's annoyed with us for not listening and not, following her wishes, she's not gonna, I don't think, I think that it just happens, right? So to me, I think we've got to figure out, we've got to compromise some way, and browbeating our consultant is the way to go. So to me, I think let's meet next week, but let's not talk about the draft report if at all possible, so that she does get the 2 weeks, but we don't lose that time.
For the record, any kind of beating of our consultant is not allowed. Brow or
You can strongly question.
We'll make sure we note that in our discussion of the task force.
Thank you, Dan. That you're really showing how to be an ally.
Since it's 7:20, I want to kill this conversation, but I want to get into what she wants us to review, so we have time, because I know Joe's leaving in 40 minutes.
Can Norm just want to make one more comment? I don't want you to think we're blowing off.
Yes.
What you said. Do you want to respond to everyone?
Dan, were you directing that to me?
Yes, because you made a comment and then people followed up. So I don't want your concern, even though we may not take any action on it, I don't want it to get lost.
Well, first of all, I hope that any discussion isn't interpreted as browbeating and making the work of the consultant difficult. My concern is with the content. And I think the discussions that we have had that center around the content are the most important. And my feeling is, I don't think we're there yet. And I think that for you to focus on completing your writing is not a bad thing, and that can be done in parallel with our continuing discussion of the content and what we all think. If there's anything that I think has been that we could focus on, is to make sure that we all are in agreement on the content. And I get a lot out of that discussion by listening to everybody else's views, which is going to inform and change the way I view things. So that's what I would be looking for.
Okay. Mary?
Yeah, I appreciate all the comments. Thank you. I'm a pretty tough nut. I'm also myself a heavy-handed editor, so I totally get other people looking at something and digging right in. I think what's a little hard for me is when I write a document, I usually significantly rewrite it about 3 times. So I will write out a draft and then I go through and edit it, and probably about 1/3 of it gets replaced with new words. And then I go through it again and probably easily another 1/3 of it gets replaced and changed. And so I think what would be helpful, and so I want to get through that part in the next 2 weeks, where I've gone through sort of my 3 different versions of the draft, really cleaned it up. So to that point, I think what remains helpful is comments from the task force on sort of high level things, like, you wrote a community driver about transportation, but you really didn't talk about what we thought was the most important message about why transportation is a community driver. Or I see you have a lot of data that you've kind of put into the state of housing chapter and you're going to write about it, but reminder that there was a suggestion that maybe we not spend very much time on that because the comp plan did it, and really focus on bringing forward the Maxfield study information. So higher level is really good. And then just give me a little bit more time to put some finish off and then polish a couple times the text itself.
Let me make one more comment, and then I think we should. And so, for example, yesterday's few emails about the rental single-family housing that Steve sent, and my comments, and Merritt sent a couple emails to the group and a couple just to me. I mean, there's an issue where there's probably not an agreement in the group. And we have to cross that bridge at some point somehow. But I don't, if we insist on reaching a consensus on that issue today, we're never going to get to tomorrow. So I'm comfortable that being out there. Not sure how, at the end of the day, 6 of you might say, Dan, you're full of it. And then I got to decide how I'm going to deal with it. But I'm comfortable knowing there's issues out there that have to be resolved so we can do a report. And I don't know how to get there, but just need to keep pushing ahead.
So Dan, to that point, there was this commentary last night about, additional units and rentals, and then there was some really good concepts that were also talked about. But where does that belong in the report? And when it gets into the report, right, and starts to become a part of the bigger picture, how do we wrap our heads around that as a task force and get to consensus, right? That's the thing. I'm not an editor, and I recognize that being an editor is a great skill, and frankly, I don't have that.
Well, I guess what I would say based on that conversation, to me, that sounds like the kind of stuff that Merritt and Stephanie are saying we should continue, where we have these conversations and talk amongst ourselves, and we continue those conversations to inform our perspective and do what Norm said, where we listen to each other, we hear each other out, maybe it provokes you to think about something differently, or and then we go back to the draft report that Merritt is polishing up in the background for our review and feedback. We can say like, hey, that conversation, I think for me, what, kind of triggered me to respond to that comment, because people send a lot of articles and I don't respond to all of them, is, I think there's affordability and housing affordability. People get very emotional, like $4,000 for an apartment, that's crazy. Well, okay, what income are we talking about? I mean, that's your personal opinion, but that's not an affordability discussion. Like I'd never spend $5 million on a house. Okay, well, you know what? Good for you, people that are going to do it. So let's talk about the numbers of what income can afford what rent, and then what jobs those are. And then the beauty of our economy is that people can self-match, and some people can't. The issue is some people have less options to match with because they have a smaller income, right? So there's less. So you make $500,000, you have a lot more matches than if you make $15,000. So how do we give people adequate matches? And some people who make $500,000 might want to spend $500 a month on an apartment. And you know what? They should be able to. That is the way the world works. So now, should they be crowding out all the people that make $15,000 that have no options? No, that's a problem. We need to figure out how to make room for everybody. But especially with new construction or whatever, people start taking on an emotional, values-based tone versus a quantitative tone. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we review the report, and we're talking about a combination of data and values and suggestions. Are suggestions being driven by and backed up by data, or are they emotional about, what should and shouldn't be in the world. And that's important to let people make their value statements, but we also need to understand it's, I think, going to be more controversial if you don't have data that supports your point of view. So, and understanding people's incomes, and it's you start getting much more touchy subjects about how much money people make and 2-income households versus 1, and how many children people have, and it just the size of the household. It can get very personal very quickly. But I do think it's important to look at it through that lens of what income level are we in, and how does that fit into our metro, because Minnesota and the Twin Cities have very high incomes relative to other submarkets in the country. You have to remember that. But that doesn't mean that all racial and ethnic groups or communities are experiencing that too. So there's a lot of nuance, but we have to remember the big data too, which is that, a median income of $95,000 is high, and the rents here are a fraction of, and it's comparable to Silicon Valley and San Francisco and other very high income areas, but their housing costs are significantly higher than here. So yes, we have an affordability. We need to look at our own crisis and not be fueled by crisis vocabulary brought in from other submarkets. We need to talk about what's happening here in our metro and in our town, Edina, and not, you rely on rhetoric, I think, from other places where people are trying to whip people into a frenzy. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I guess that's how, we should, in my mind, Joe, to answer your question, and Dan, get to the end, is that as we look at the draft and we start thinking about what are we really saying, what words are we really using, and do we have data, Maxfield, other data, to back up these value statements or recommendations? And then as we look at the data, maybe we tweak our recommendations and our language, because to be consistent and feel like something that all of us, or a majority of us, or there's dissent within the group, and some people think this and some people think that, and then it's up to our elected officials to decide what direction they want to go.
So I just want to use yesterday's example and say kind of how I took that in thinking about the report. Is I sent out the article, which I thought was really interesting. I personally think that that's a niche that there's probably been a lot of demand for that hasn't been filled very much yet, is that idea of getting sort of that single family lot, but not having all of the caretaking of it. So I found the article interesting from an affordability perspective. It certainly isn't affordable housing if you're thinking about 80% of AMI or lower. But my question for the report would be then, so I just put in a section saying, oh, here's, when we're talking about housing diversity in Edina, here's an example of a new trend and why it's popular with people. But for the report, then the question would be, if Edina only has some land that would take, say, new construction, as a task force, what do you want to call out as kind of the priority for new housing units in the city? So is that a form that, if there's demand there, but it's for a market rate group of people, do you want something like that highlighted as a new option, or would you rather focus on more deeply affordable solutions and missing middle housing?
Steve, you need to get off mute.
Yeah, I didn't notice that I had been put on mute, but I think we have been charged by the city council to ensure that we consider all housing options and not focus solely on affordable housing, because there are groups that need housing, seniors being one of the obvious ones. that we have to make sure that we clearly identify how much housing is needed for them and what's the priority for that. And so we can do the same thing with other target audiences. And I think we've tried to articulate that in a couple of different ways, but I think you're absolutely right. We should identify for the city council what we think the priorities should be for all the different target audiences. And if we have specific solutions, great. So from my perspective, our focus should be on the goals and the strategies. And I think that's where we've spent most of our energy. And if people want to make additions to the strategies or any changes to those things, I think that's value added for the team. For the rest of it, I think we can let Merritt work. See, Merritt's got her hand raised, but she's on mute.
I'm muted. I forgot it. Can I want Stephanie to keep moving with the agenda, but Tom raised his hand, or maybe he raised his hand because I was muted. So
No, yeah.
okay. So as politely as possible, can we? I appreciate what everyone's saying. Can we hand it back to Stephanie for her to continue?
Yes, and then I am going to go and I have been muting people periodically because there's that really loud background noise, and so I just so just before you talk, you're probably muted, so just be aware of that. Merritt, do you want to proceed with the section that you want us to review and discuss and focus our time on for the remainder?
Yeah, let's take some time to look at the community driver section.
Okay, then I will share screen. Can you see it all? I will make it 150. There we go. Does that work? Okay.
Yep. So what I ended up doing in the community driver section is I have an intro statement, and Stephanie, if you can maybe just shrink it a little bit so you can just scroll and show people kind of the sections. So we have I started with the Edina vision statement, which seemed really consistent with this section. Then I went into jobs and conversation about jobs. Then into schools. Spent a while here, and we can talk about this, but this is a section I kind of wrestled with. All right, keep going. Then transportation. And the last piece was conversation about neighborhoods. So with that, why don't we go back to the beginning? For each section, I'll just say a little bit about kind of the overarching point I was trying to make, and then we can open it up for conversation. Hopefully some people have a chance to take a look at it. So with the jobs piece, I tried to highlight that healthy communities typically have a strong and diverse job space, so that there are opportunities for all different types of people to be employed in the city where they work. However, I also made the point that because Edina is, in the middle of a region and there are so many different cities, that connection between residents and jobs, isn't the same. It's inevitable that there will be a lot of commuting back and forth. And so, Edina doesn't need to think about providing housing that precisely matches the people who are working in the community, because only a small percentage of people working there live there. I then talked about, tried to focus on what can be healthy for a city and what a lot of cities, particularly in greater Minnesota, are struggling with, is to have housing in the community that people who work in the city can live in, and that this is most challenging at the level of like service workers, hospital aides, teachers, city staff that are not as far along in their career. So if you go down just a little bit, Stephanie, to the next page. And then I wanted to look at how housing prices compare to median income over time. And I looked at the data. I didn't get it in here yet, but what you see in the Blaine chart is very similar to what we're going to see in Edina, based on the data I was starting to look at, which is the difference between the two hasn't changed that much in the past 10 years. It's been relatively similar, where the real jump in housing prices happened relative to median household income was before 2010. So if we're going to look back, say, to 1970 or 1980, it would be very clear that it used to be much easier for people to be able to purchase a home in Edina in a range of professions than it would be today, but that this has been fairly steady for the past decade. All right, go down a little bit more. So that was kind of the crux of that section. And so what I'd like to know is are those hitting the points that people had in mind or not? Steve?
Just a small technical question. You mentioned that you're going to get new data for Edina. Is that process already underway and you're working on that and you don't see any issues in being able to get a new Edina chart versus the Blaine chart?
Yeah, I was looking at just this data yesterday and starting to map it. And I find it a little misleading to jump from data that spans a decade to data that's year by year. And so I didn't plug anything in yet because I wanted to try to figure out how to do one of those charts that has like a little lightning bolt that shows that there's been a shift in scale. Anyway, but this data I have in a spreadsheet right now, ready to go.
Great.
What I don't have is pre-1990, and that was what Stephanie said, is what is our ability to get pre-1990? So there are a number of those things that I'll be sending to Antonio Rosell on the team because he's been mining data for years and years and years in his work. So he'll be able to figure out if we can go further back.
Okay, so my question was simply, do we have a mechanism for creating charts like this? And it sounds like your answer is yes, we do. Okay, thank you.
Can you go back to it, Stephanie? So a couple comments. One, so I think looking at housing vis-a-vis employment, especially in small communities in geographically in a metropolitan area, doesn't give you a correct picture. So, you could live in far western Richfield and work at Fairview Hospital and be closer to it than live where I live in far western Edina and work at Fairview Hospital. So the geographic location of work and where people live is not all that important because in a sense, the corporate boundaries of any city are arbitrary. So I don't, and then there's reasons the nature of the people living in the city change over time, and it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. So a community may become more of a bedroom community, and its housing prices might go up because people are bidding up the house prices to live there because they want to be there, because they work downtown but they want to be in a good school district, or they like being close to Highway 100s because it's easy to get out of town on weekends. In the summer, they head up north. So when you do a graph like this Blaine 2040 comprehensive plan graph, you have to ignore so much data that, to me, at the end of the day, what's presented here gives you something that you can't do anything with.
Dan, I think what you're saying is true, and someone else pipe in. But one of the questions remains is there's an anecdote of a gentleman going up to the mayor and saying, why are we focused on affordable housing? And the gentleman had moved into Edina in the 70s or 80s, and I think he was in construction. He was in the trades. And, you know, they had a conversation about what his income was proportional to the house he bought in Edina at that time. And it was feasible. He could, and he raised children. But someone in his same industry nowadays could not buy a house in Edina. And so there's this feeling out there about Achieve Edina, that Edina should be available for those who have worked their way into being able to afford to live here. Yet a lot of people, yet at the same time, Edina is an aging population, and a lot of people that live in Edina have moved here years and years ago. So their reality at the time they moved here is vastly different than someone that was at the same income level that they were at the time they moved in, and their ability to move into Edina. So the concept of Achieve Edina is very different. And so I think that what these generalized graphs, because you're right, you can't have data does not reflect all the different neighborhoods and all the different types of people that work here. It gives a story. It's a generalized story. And so I think this type of graph shows that what was generally achievable back in the 80s and 70s is not generally achievable for those same types of folks now.
Oh, I agree with that. I don't necessarily think there's a value judgment to be put on that. So whenever this gentleman moved here, he had to achieve, you know, it's such a pejorative phrase, but I'll use it. He had to achieve Edina. He had to have an income, right? He had to save up for a down payment. Not everybody in 1970 in the metropolitan area could afford a house in Edina. So the fact that it's become more exclusive, and exclusive meaning it's tended towards higher incomes, is not necessarily good or bad, right? Now,
but I think these graphs show that this is the way it is. Back then, someone with moderate income as a teaching assistant could achieve Edina as a teaching assistant. Now a teaching assistant, they can't.
I agree. But I'm saying that's not necessarily good or bad.
Right. But it's a story. It just lays it out. And so I don't think this is a value thing. It's just showing the change over time.
It is necessarily a value thing, because the value is Edina is worse off because the distribution of household incomes is skewed towards the top end. That's the value statement. And I'm saying maybe it's just a fact of life, and there's other things we should look at.
So I'd like to use the example that Stephanie had up on the page, and you can see I just highlighted the first part of it in gray. So the paragraph that's under the chart, I'm going to read it aloud. People who are visual, you can read along with your eyes, because this is how I tried to treat that kind of a topic, Dan, you know, in light of what you and some others have been saying about tone and whatnot. So I said, if the city of Edina wants to be home for people who work there, then city options should align with Edina employees' salaries and attractive housing types. If housing options are most suited to a subset of workers at higher income levels, then it is likely to be undersupplied for people who serve the residents of Edina, such as young professionals, office workers, trades, teachers, firefighters, and healthcare aides. So that was the way I framed it.
Yeah. So it is. There are. I could name multiple groups that Edina undersupplies housing for, not just people who work here. I'm sure there's people who drive through Edina and see a house that's $1.5 million, and they would love to be here, but they can only afford $1 million, and there's nothing in the $1 million that fits what their needs are. So let me finish and I'll listen to you. For me, the statement, if the city wants to be home for people who work there, that is so broad. It's almost incomprehensible to me. There are so many choices a household has to make, and where they live is just one of them. And to think that Edina, this tiny speck in this metropolitan area, is going to house all the people who work here is just inefficient. Okay, so take the humanity out of it a second, and just imagine the Twin Cities is just a big factory, and you're trying to be as efficient as possible. You might move assets every day from Richfield or Savage or Blaine to come to Edina to do some work and to go home at night, because that's the more efficient thing. And it might be the most efficient and best thing for those assets that move.
I'm interested in what others have to say. So I just, I think that this is really about the question of, I'll call it economic segregation for lack of a better word, but, you know, to what extent should the Twin Cities kind of be pockets of different levels of housing affordability? And does any single community within the region, should its housing stock reflect the demand that exists for people who work in, say, that area of the region or not? So
I think Bernadette, Norm, and Tom. Bernadette, Norm, then Tom.
Okay.
Well, I guess two comments. You know, in the world that we're living in today, where people work is more fluid than it's ever been before. So I think the idea of, you know, the office worker going to their cubicle or their corner office is perhaps a thing of the past for some people, where they maybe go to the office once or twice a week and then they work from home. And so where you live is, and the size, you know, maybe you suddenly need a bigger house or think, you know, I think the value, I think we just, given the timing of the report, I don't want it to sound outdated the minute that we publish it. You know, it's like if we were talking about a VCR or something, everyone's going to streaming. You know, I don't want it to sound antiquated. So I don't know if the anecdote of the people who work in the city. I mean, to me, I think if we want to have, I think personally, the way I would frame it, rather than around this like faux question of workers and where they should be housed, is, do we want to be a diverse community with with diverse housing types, diverse income levels, a variety, and that if we go with the variety is the spice of life, and in fact we do want those things, maybe we're not getting inside people about why they're living here. It might be because they don't want to commute. Maybe people love a long drive and they like to listen to their podcasts, or maybe they're here for the schools, or I think if we just put it out there without kind of a pseudoscience behind it, I think it's almost more powerful than trying to frame it into some sort of like quasi-economic argument about why we need housing diversity or diversity of housing stock or housing available at a diverse income level. So I guess that's my opinion.
I've got a couple of comments. First of all, I apparently need some coaching because I wrote about 2 pages of comments on the draft yesterday, and they're not showing up. So I'll have to figure out what I'm doing wrong to make sure that the comments actually show up in everybody's copy.
I opened up the Google Doc form. Did you put the comments in the Word version form?
No, I put it in the Google Docs form. At any rate, as a general comment, I made this comment a couple of weeks ago that I think that the whole report started off having somewhat of a dark view of Edina. And I think that this section continues that, not to the same extent, but we can look at it 2 different ways. We can say that Edina isn't providing enough affordable housing, and it should really look like all the other suburbs, or we can celebrate the fact that not only has Edina been very successful in increasing housing values because we have quality housing, we have a lot of the things that make this a wonderful place to live, but we are also, there's a great deal of work going on both to meet some allocation of affordable housing and providing a wide variety of housing for a lot of different preferences. And then the last comment that I had was regarding the section, the paragraph that you read, Merritt, and that talks about the number of jobs. And it's not clear that we have employers who are saying there's a gap, I can't attract people. If that were the case, then we would feel like we need to address that. But I don't know of any data that says employers can't find employees. So those are my comments.
You're right. There's no data that I know of either, other than what the chamber said, that that middle managers tend to circulate a little bit faster in Edina because they find something closer to their homes.
And
it's anecdotal.
And if we provide, there's no guarantee that what the situation is today will be the situation tomorrow. People change jobs regularly. So if somebody lives in Edina and works in Edina today, next year they may find a better job instead of working for Southdale, working for North Memorial, and they may be commuting to Robbinsdale. We have a very mobile workforce these days.
I know there are a couple other questions. Can I just jump in with a couple questions of my own, which might inform what people are saying or if they'll help to address it? The first basic question is, when you wanted to have a community drivers section, it was to talk about the relationship or the importance of these other things in making Edina strong. Now, this is a housing chapter, So I'd like someone to try to articulate, when you envision the report, and we had a section on community drivers about jobs, what did you envision that section would say that would then set up the recommendation of goals and strategies? And that goes to my next point, which is, if your recommendations are going to say that we need to focus more on providing housing for people of middle incomes or lower incomes, because that's what the market study said the demand is, then how does what's written previously in the report set up that strategy in a way that people say, okay, I understand why that's a priority that they've identified here. So all of these sections should be communicating something that when the person gets to the strategies, they understand why. It doesn't say, we think that housing in the future should focus on $2 million condominiums.
I'll take a swing at that. The amount of affordable housing that we are targeting to provide, it's focused on a goal that has been allocated to us by the Metropolitan Council. Besides that, there ought to be an effort to provide a wide variety of housing in the city of Edina. I don't know that we've got any specific data that says we cannot attract employees of any particular type. The statement that was made by the Chamber of Commerce, it was a pretty weak statement, not backed up by any data. And I think that is really open to question. I think the fact that Edina has a population that is skewed towards higher income is not a bad thing. I think that the fact that the market is providing housing that is more skewed towards higher income is not a bad thing. I think it's something that can be celebrated. If we were able to come up with data that said employers just were not able to find employees of a certain category, then I think that would be something that we should focus on. I don't see it so far.
I guess in all of this, one thing we did talk about was the environmental impact. And if people have shorter commutes, presumably there's less environmental impact because they have, you don't have so much polluting cars and whatnot. Plus, they have more time to do other things in their life besides drive a car. Now, I agree what everybody has said to a degree. On the other hand, you know, our goal of whether it's 950 or 1800, a significant chunk of that is people that are no longer working. They're the elderly. So we're just creating kind of if they move to an apartment or a condominium or a co-op or something that's affordable, presumably they are leaving a home behind that may go on the market to people of a middle or upper middle income bracket. So the environmental thing is the thing I wanted to add. Also, you do have a lot of very low income people that take long commutes by bus from the lower income areas. I mean, Dan made a good point. You know, if you live in South Minneapolis or Richfield, you know, Fairview isn't that far away. You could probably even walk there, depending on how far you are. But I just wanted to add the environmental impact and having people close. Also, we don't know how the market can change. I mean, if Norm and I were talking about this really low interest rates today. Well, if those things shot up, a lot of our $1.5 million housing would be in trouble. So I like the section on jobs, and we need to talk about that. We also want a diversity of housing because, as I've said before, it's like you want a diversified portfolio for your investment. Places like Richfield and St. Louis Park, Brooklyn Center, they all sort of started at the same time, and they all sort of hit a certain demographic, and they got into trouble when that demographic shifted. So we're fortunate in that we have a variety of housing. So I think that's something to think about too. And, again, I think that sometimes there's a moral issue about if you're going to hire somebody, is there housing that's nearby? It may not be right in Edina, it might be South Minneapolis, might be Richfield, but that becomes an issue. Granted, people change jobs, or you have a 2-income household, so maybe the housing you pick is halfway in between the 2 jobs that presently you and your spouse have, and then one of you changes jobs for whatever reason. So those are kind of my points that I'd like to see about the job topic. And it was kind of a revelation to me as how many people actually work in Edina. And so that's kind of all I had to say, but everybody has made some good points on this issue. So I'm done.
I am going to say something. I haven't said a thing the whole day, but in terms of providing housing spectrum for all people, just on social media the other day, someone talks about looking for house cleaner at a lower cost. I am making assumptions. I don't know the square footage of this house, but I'm assuming it's a big house. They're looking for someone to come and clean their house and pay them cheap. So I'm trying to think, okay, that person has to come from somewhere else, because definitely they can't find a place here in Edina at the rate where you're going to be paying them. Hello, can you? Hello?
We can hear you. I can hear you.
So I am thinking we need to be able to still be cognizant of that, whether it is the caretakers coming to take care of the lawn, or the housekeeper coming to clean the house, or the nanny. Well, they're definitely not being paid enough to live in Edina. So we still need to be able to be considerate of that. And the very people who live in big homes are the ones who are very stingy when it comes to paying. So I'm just going to say we need to consider the middle and low income for the benefit of the entire community and economy specifically. We may not have data to quantify that, but I'm just giving you a very real example. If it's a landscaper or your house cleaning person, you're not paying them enough for them to afford the current apartment in Edina.
I beg to differ, but I have people that I pay that live in Edina in apartments.
Steve?
I think we need to simply recognize, and many people have used this term, that we need diverse housing going forward. And part of that is simply because we have it today. 40% of our housing today is affordable housing. I think people have in their heads an image of Edina as being a bedroom community made up of primarily single-family homes. that are either like a country club or like something up in Interlaken. And what we want to do is just make sure everybody understands that Edina today is actually a very diverse community. And we just want to keep that going. And the Met Council, in assigning the numbers, is essentially saying the same thing. You have a certain amount today. We want you to increase it by a certain amount more. And here's the goal. So what we want to do, I think, is just make sure we're not letting people use easy shorthand stereotypes to paint a picture of Edina that's simply not true. Edina is very diverse, and it needs to continue to work in that direction. It seems to be a winning recipe.
So follow up on Steve's comment, and then I want to say something about Janet. So it doesn't matter to me if he well, as a homeowner, I want the value of my asset not to decline, as anyone would. But it doesn't matter to me if we're more economically diverse or less economically diverse. It doesn't matter to me if we're more racially diverse or less racially diverse, as long as someone's not forcing the scale on it. And the Met Council, there's two reasons we would do affordable housing, or put in policies that make our present housing more affordable. The Met Council is pressuring us to take an allocation. Okay, there's necessarily no net benefit to Edina to take that allocation, other than to stay in the good graces of the Met Council. You know, I don't think you can make the case that we're better off or worse off taking that allocation. But there may be value reasons that we want more affordable housing. We may want a more, the citizens of Edina might say, you know what, I would like a more racially integrated city to live in. Well, one way of doing that is provide affordable housing. Or they might more economically diverse, and the same thing to do it. but we're only doing the Met Council because of political pressure. And it's not, the Met Council may say, Edina, our calculations, you need this housing. That's patently untrue. The Met Council needs cities to take their allocation so they can get to their number that they think is necessary. But it's not imperative. No one has shown me that it's imperative that Edina takes it for those reasons. There may be other reasons to take it.
I'd like to second, Steve, your comments. I would like the tone of this whole report, and particularly this section, to celebrate all the good things that Edina has done and is doing. And part of that is it's a wide diversity of housing. And, as you said, there's 40% of the current housing is affordable. And if anything, I think that's part of what we should show as a background and have the data to support that, to make sure that when we talk about affordable housing, we're covering all the things that the history of the housing that has been in place. It's important to know how it's changing, and it's important to know the commitment that the city has to continue to provide a wide spectrum of housing. So I think there's a very positive story here. So thank you, Steve.
This is Merit. I want to get, so it's 8:15. I want to try to get focused back on the point of the community's drivers section. So again, the report is building towards goals and strategies that you state. And I think it's been well articulated that those goals and strategies are responsive to comprehensive plan policy that the city has already articulated. It's responsive to Metropolitan Council allocation items, So what was the purpose? What purpose does the community drivers section hold for the report? What do we say about jobs, schools, transportation that relates to what comes later? Is it simply a section to say these are other important systems in the city and we have good housing because these other systems are strong? Because what I tried to do when I looked at them is I tried to figure out what the hook was and the connection to housing that would set up the goals and strategies. And so for schools, for instance, I've really struggled with that. Because Edina has good schools, there's also a lot of school choice. I tried to look at the school district data on what types of housing provide student yield. Anyway, I would like both now for people to articulate and, in the coming week for people to really try to communicate to me and to each other, however, what would be said in these topics under community drivers.
This is Norm, and my view of the community drivers is to provide a context for this report. And the overall theme that we've talked about in the past, and I think it's important, is to talk about what makes Edina a great place to live, what has driven the housing in Edina in the past. And the things that we have talked about are certainly including schools, and it's, affordable housing is not to provide enrollment to the schools, because the schools are going to satisfy whatever enrollment is presented. But in my opinion, the reason that schools are important is because the Edina public school system has been recognized across the state and nationally as one of the top school systems. And it's a prime reason why people want to come to live in Edina. And I think it's not too much more difficult than that. Now, also, as I looked at the community drivers, we previously had listed 3 other trends. One was suburban to urban, second was quality of life, and third was population growth as the painting the picture of the context of what has happened in Edina and why Edina is a great place to live. And probably the overall trend is that Edina has a great variety of types of housing that meets the needs of a variety of people with different preferences. So that's my view of the reason why we have community drivers and the message that should be included in it.
So Norm, I hope I was trying to, that part you were emphasizing about housing diversity and options, I really tried to hit that point in the neighborhoods portion of this community drivers section. So just want to be sure you have a chance to really look at that in detail this week if you haven't, and see if that kind of fits what you were just describing and hoping that we would communicate. Others?
Yeah, I like the community driver section, and it gives you a history as to why this community has been so successful. Like Norm and Joe and some others, I was attracted to Edina because of the strong school system. Having spent my life in the inner city, I knew the value of a strong school system, or it's not just the system, but the parents and the kids that go there. So I appreciate the community drivers. I want to step back just a moment. If we were even to meet the lower goal or the higher goal, we'd probably only address the job needs of somewhere between 600 and 1,200 job slots, or somewhere between 1.5 to 3% of the 40,000. So I just want to get that focus on the affordable housing, just to bring up or get that perspective. But I agree with Norm that the job or the schools are important. There is a variety. Merritt, I wish we could have a one-on-one conversation, because I don't know if I've given you what you wanted for schools earlier, but I gave you what I know from sitting in on this section and the data requests I got earlier. I think the transportation is something people didn't maybe fully appreciate, and I think that's a good issue. As far as some of the other qualities, the urban to suburban, I think that is an attractive thing, at least in my neighborhood. Most of the people that moved in still wanted that kind of urban feel with the sidewalks and being close to where the action is. But then there are people that live in Southwest Edina where you have more of the traditional suburban subdivisions. So I do kind of like, I think it what makes the suburb attractive. The Edina attractive is there's something for both lifestyle choices. So that's kind of really all I wanted to add. And Merritt, if hopefully I've sent you the information you want on schools, and if you want to play with it, that's fine. I mean, you will, but you know, if there's something more you want from me on that, please email me or call me. That's it, my 2 cents. Oh, and you know, years ago, a lot of people used to have servants' quarters, which would look a lot like an ADU. So maybe that's another reason for ADUs. So people's nannies or full-time domestic staff would have a nearby place to live.
Steve?
Meredith, I don't know if this will help you or not, maybe revisiting history, but part of the idea in the communities driver section was to acknowledge what we saw as fears in the community about what this housing task force might recommend and how it would impact those things that were to be of great value by the citizens of Edina. So people were very concerned that whatever we recommend not somehow undermine the quality of the school system. That's somehow not radically change the character of Edina in terms of radically shifting from suburban to urban or something. So this community drivers was intended to say, we're aware of the concerns, we acknowledge them, we don't think we're going to do anything that will undermine those. In fact, we believe we're going to strengthen many of the things that make Edina strong. That was the kind of the original intent of the community drivers section. You've expanded that slightly to provide a couple more background areas to think about. But I think what we want to make sure we do is communicate to people that we're aware of these issues, we've thought about them, we believe we've addressed them appropriately, and we're confident that our recommendations will take Edina forward in a good way.
Thank goodness Joe is off the call, because he'd be saying, see, this is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning. We're never going to get to the bottom of these issues. Were you trying to say something? Janet, you're trying to say something?
I don't have anything to add on.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so again, I'd like everybody to, I will be making some changes based on what I heard here, but again, I welcome people to send, to make their comments in the draft that we will post to the meeting, to our next meeting. Again, always look to the next meeting folder for things that you should be commenting on and reviewing in advance of that meeting. So take a look at community drivers in detail. Let me know what else, you know, I should be shifting. So let's turn a minute to state of housing and the Maxfield report, which were the two sections that I was going to focus on for the rest of this week. And there had been an idea, I think Stephen mentioned last week, is maybe we don't spend too much time on what the state of housing in Edina is, other than just kind of reviewing the basics, because this was covered so much already in the comprehensive plan, so why reiterate the same information, and instead focus on the Maxfield study as new information that this report is using to inform its goals and strategies. So in the, you know, in the current document, I had put a chunk of information that might be covered in the state of housing today and the 2040 comp plan. But should I really be focusing most of it on Maxfield study?
So let me, first of all, before we miss it, catch that typo. There's no space in the box when the population, there's no space between the and population.
Okay.
So I want to comment on that, what you've called out there. So when you say communities in this context, do you mean Edina, or do you mean the Twin Cities?
Okay, sorry, help me, tell me the page number.
Well, it's on the screen. State of Housing Edina, you call out in the box, I don't mean you, I mean we do. It says when the population stays the same. What is communities referring to?
Any, I think. I mean, it's a generalized.
So it could be Edina. Okay.
Yeah, it could be Edina, because in Edina, there's maybe a number of people. Okay. Households are smaller.
No. I just want to clarify that. So my point is, yes, populations, the average number of people in households has declined dramatically since 1952, 55. But that doesn't, the aggregate population of Edina is not a goal anywhere. Okay, so if everyone in Edina, how about this? People decide to stay in their homes longer. The net effect of that will be more empty nesters and more widows and widowers living at home, and the population size is going to decline. Do we draw from that we have to build more houses in Edina? It's just a change in people's preference. Why would Edina have to turn itself upside down because its population is declining? Steve?
Well, just to pick up on the specific example that Dan is using, if people chose to live here longer, the general trend for those people is to downsize. They want to get out of the big home that they're in and they want to move into something smaller. And if we don't have that unit for them, then they'll move somewhere else.
Well, I agree. That wasn't my point. Was if there was a market change that people just wanted to stay in their house longer. Okay, because let's say that in-home care became significantly cheaper. So it was easier for people to stay in their houses longer. What the net effect of that would be is that the household size would decline in Edina and the population would decline in Edina. And my response to that would be, that's okay. People are making choices. We don't have to supercharge the population of Edina just because people want to stay in their houses longer. So I don't think, and I assume, Merritt, you called out this box statement here. I don't think there's any need to do something to make sure the population of Edina either stays the same or increases. However, if there is, then let's state what that reason is, because maybe I'm missing something here. I don't see it.
I'm gonna disagree with that because when the population decreases, we're definitely going to be on the decline as a community. So it's a healthy mix for the population to keep increasing. Specifically, a school is really a major driver of a healthy community. So if we do not have young families moving in to keep the school sustained, and the other surrounding economics that come as a direct result of that, we are just going to be on the decline. I don't think that's what we want. So a healthy mix of elderly moving into other options and leaving those homes for new families to occupy so our schools can be populated, because our funding formula right now is based on per pupil in the school. So if we do not have new young children coming in as the seniors graduate, that doesn't bode well for a healthy community. So I'm going to disagree. Well, we may not know why everyone chooses to stay longer in their home and we cannot force them out. But definitely, we don't want to have a declining of our population. Remaining the same is not equally, it's okay, but it's not healthy as well. But that's my 2 cents.
Even though I threw a roadblock in front of you, why don't you continue on with your comments about state of housing in Edina?
This is Norm. I don't think there's a population decrease is an issue. We've seen continuous population increases since the 70s, so I don't think that's a real issue. One of the statements in the paragraph next to the box, the last item is communities attract new residents and retain long-term neighbors only if zoning is updated to address shifting family sizes. Existing housing can be adapted for today and tomorrow's residents only if zoning is updated to legalize enough of the needed types of homes. Again, I look at the data, and the only indicator that would say our houses aren't being updated properly would be high vacancy rates. And I don't know that we've got high vacancy rates in areas that needs zoning increases. And so, Merritt, do you have any data that shows that there's any housing segments where we do have high vacancy rates that would indicate there needs to be changes?
So what I'm not implying here that there are vacancy rates. I'm saying that if you want to give people that have lived in Edina the opportunity to stay there, and you want new people to come in, then you want to try to reflect what the trends are in the type of housing that people seek. So this has always been true. I mean, realtors, when they build homes, you know, there were times when you wanted a butler pantry if you were a high-end home, or you wanted a separate living room from your kitchen, and then it changes, and so realtors update what they're providing in the market to meet taste. So types and sizes of housing are the same thing. You know, are you updating them to meet the taste of people that are looking to move into a new community, or the changing taste of people that want to stay in the community? For instance, people in my generation, as the kids move out of the house, tend to talk about moving out of their single family home within the next 5 years, whereas in my parents' generation, they never imagined themselves moving out of their single family home, even when they're empty nest. So it isn't the idea that you have to build a home in Edina. It's if you're keeping up to reflect market interest.
So I follow up on Norm. You know, the statement, existing homes can be adapted for tomorrow's residents only if zoning is updated. I don't get that. I mean, there's probably no more dynamic market of changes in homes other than downtown Minneapolis than Edina. People buy homes, they tear them down. They buy homes, they do significant renovations, or they buy homes and it's not exactly what they want, but they make it work for them. So what is the zoning change that is needed to meet the market?
More alternatives to single-family housing.
Okay, so in Edina, this is a somewhat oversimplification. We can provide more housing either by doing dense housing in commercial nodes or eliminating single-family housing. And those two cover 90% of what can happen. And one of them's probably somewhat popular, and the other one is extremely unpopular.
So let me step back a minute, because I think this kind of conversation is why you've been meeting so long as a task force, is trying to figure out if you can get on the same page about how you see the world of housing, what you think is important for a community, why it's needed. And so we spent, you know, a lot of time over the past months talking about whether the conversation should shift more to that there is an allocation that the Met Council has articulated. There is a market study that articulates what type of new housing is most undersupplied relative to demand, and that your goals and strategies would focus on that. So, you know, we can have arguments for a long time, or, you know, conversations about whether things are good or bad, but I think we moved to the point of saying, here are the givens, and how is this report written to articulate goals and strategies that this group feels are important to move forward based on what has been given. And so I could do a report that's pure numbers, for instance, that says, here are the assumptions we've been given, and based on that and the amount of land in the city and current zoning, et cetera, we can or cannot create that many number of housing units and of that type. And if we can't do it, here's what has to change. Or the report can, as I've been doing, try to articulate the case for moving forward with the goals and strategies other than they've been given to you, and that's what you have to work with, but you don't necessarily agree on why or how.
Let me go back to your wording. I appreciate what you said, but on this specific, tomorrow's residents only if zoning is updated to legalize enough of the needed types of homes. So forget for a second the arguments I've made against using needed, because it's real, in my mind, it's really wanted, but forget that for a second. Okay. What type of zoning, if this became the report and went to the city council, what type of zoning changes would they consider? It doesn't have to be merit anybody. What kind of zoning changes do you think the city should consider to update our zoning?
We have very few zoning changes built into our recommended strategies. The only thing that we have even touched on is suggesting that the city do more small area plans related to changing the zoning along Vernon, France, and Valley View. Other than that, we really haven't gotten into specific zoning changes.
No, I agree with that, but if this sentence is in here, it's telling the city council, look at the zoning, and so what do we want them to look at? Do we want them to say, do we want to eliminate single family housing? Do we want them to say, if you're in a commercial node so defined, you get a 20% bonus for your density? I don't know where. I want to know where that sentence is city council to.
Well, maybe Merritt could expand on that a little bit, but I'm also thinking, and maybe this isn't strictly zoning, more like land use, but maybe people don't want these huge lots, and maybe they would rather have a small luxurious house with a little backyard and a little front yard. So that might be an example of responding to changing tastes that would fit in. You know, I agree it probably needs a little more explanation to it, but you know, there are evolving tastes. I mean, at one time, people thought it was horrible that you'd have to live in a townhouse because you've somehow failed in the world. But now people think, well, that's a great option. I like that option. I don't want a little grass and I want somebody else to cut it. So I would just say to the town council, to the city council, to keep reviewing the subject. Just don't stay with the same zoning you had 20 years ago.
Okay, so take for example, Rolling Green. There's probably not in area of Edina, more expensive homes, larger lots. Are we saying to the city council, if you buy a home in Rolling Green, you can any lot in there can subdivide, or any lot in there can do affordable housing, or any lot in there could do a multi-unit apartment building? I'm not advocating that, nor am I saying we shouldn't. I just want to know what do we mean by zoning is updated in a specifics.
This is Merritt. I think at some point when we talked about land use regulation and some other things, Stephanie said, you know, the report should provide general direction, and then it's up to the council and staff to pick the specific tool. So for instance, on zoning, I would interpret that to mean something like there need to be more opportunities for missing middle housing types in zoning districts in the city. And here are some current zoning restrictions that make that difficult. And you wouldn't say then what the tools are to fix it, you just say it's something that needs to be looked at relative to zoning. So how specific do you want to be? And Dan, I think your point is great, because I got mixed signals from the city council. I felt that some of them were looking for kind of those general recommendations, and I felt like others were looking for the task force to stick their neck out and make some really specific, tough recommendations that then would give them the ability to bring them forward without too much fire. Anyone want to jump on those provocative statements?
Yeah, this is Norm. I've got some major concerns here. We have jumped into writing without really coming to a consensus on what the key objectives are for this report. Merritt, you made a statement that the city needs enough housing units to be able to grow to satisfy needs. My understanding from the comp plan was it provided for land use regulation for more than enough housing units that anybody could conceivably ever implement in the city of Edina. So that's coming at things from two different ends of the spectrum. And I think that we still have some work to do among ourselves to really make sure that we all are in agreement with what the key objectives and the messages need to be from this overall report. My sense is we're not quite there yet. And personally, I think that this discussion we've had today has been very, very important. And I think we're getting closer to really coming to more of a consensus on what those issues are. But given that we are focused on a draft report at the end of the month, I think we need more this time like this to really make sure we are in agreement.
Steve?
We had a very robust process, I thought, where we each had a chance to talk and then vote on our goals and strategies. So I think our goals and strategies section of this reflects consensus across the entire task force. And what we should be doing is simply saying, okay, what do we need to ensure that we goals and those strategies. And anything that doesn't seem to be supported or lead to one of the goals and strategies, we should question why we're saying it. So kind of work backwards from the goals and strategies and say, okay, we've said this, we've had a long discussion, we agreed on it, we voted. So now what do we need to say to make sure that people understand how we got to this point? And I think we can do that. I don't think we're that far off I don't think we have to go back to square one in terms of having a consensus. We've agreed on what is the bulk of our report. Now we simply have to make sure that we put enough rationale behind that other people will end up at about the same spot that we did.
Well, a key point to test that is, does the comp plan provide for enough flexibility to provide the number of housing units that we think are going to be required to give Edina residents the flexibility to obtain the housing that they think that they need?
The answer to that question is yes, it does.
Okay, that's a pretty key issue. And Merritt, if I understood what you were saying before, you did not believe that that was correct. Did I misunderstand you?
Sorry, that what was correct?
The issue is, does the comp plan provide sufficient flexibility to provide more than enough housing units of different types to meet the demands and the preferences of residents of Edina? Now, did I misunderstand you, or did you believe that that was not the case?
No, I mean, when you look at, I mean, the housing section is somewhat general, but then if you couple it with the land use policy, you know, the Met Council requires that the comp plan identify changes to land use or zoning that would enable the city to accommodate that. And so the comp plan has done that, and there is some flexibility in how it's achieving that because it didn't get down to precise, you know, acreage on some things. So I sort of feel like we're in Groundhog Day. It comes back to the point, if that was achieved in the comp plan and that's sort of the level that is appropriate, then what is the role of this report?
In fact, my understanding of the comp plan is it did talk about acreage, and it talked about the allowable number of housing units that could be developed in those specific areas, which are going to be more than sufficient to provide for any of the housing needs in the city of Edina.
Right,
So
sorry, that's what I meant, that there's some flexibility room in there, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we can take comfort in that we have not come forward to say we think a radical change is necessary in zoning to satisfy the kinds of housing that we think we need. We haven't proposed a radical change. Things that we have proposed are very minor, nibbling at the edges. We think maybe ADUs might be a good idea kind of recommendation. So I think we're in good shape there, but that still leaves us with the question of, we need to supply 1,000 additional units for seniors. They're going to be rental units. Most of them will be market rate units. And we have to figure out how we're going to make that happen. We have to then provide an additional almost 1,000 units that are affordable for a different group of people. So we have two big chunks of numbers that we have to satisfy. We just need to make sure that we put forward proposals that will address both those target audiences, and that the city council, when they're looking at development proposals being brought forward, would be able to say, does this address seniors? Does this address the need for affordable housing? And if it does, then we should give it preferential treatment and move it forward.
But those
if
are
it's asking for more single-family homes, that's not something that we need.
Yeah. But those two areas, Steve, senior and affordable, those are financial viability questions, not zoning questions.
Yeah, probably.
So there, you know, I don't, other than ADUs, which is, there may be 5 more ADUs over the next 10 years. So other than that, I don't see any changes needed in zoning.
Right, and we've all agreed that.
Okay.
That's why we don't have any goals or strategies that say that we need to.
Then
we did talk about parking.
Go ahead, Mary.
Sorry, we did talk about things like parking, though.
Parking is a way to ensure that it is financially feasible for a developer to build affordable housing, or maybe some senior housing may fall into the same issue where requiring 2 underground parking spaces for seniors is just not important. Too many of them rely on public transportation or just don't, they're happy to walk to the grocery store and the drugstore or whatever.
Store design standards, those are zoning.
Yeah. That's not a zoning issue. We see some things as barriers to making it easy to build certain types of housing.
Let me say
on
this.
the
Sorry.
on the zoning, I for one don't support continuing single family zoning because I feel like that's kind of a perversion of the market. But that aside, I know that would go over like a lead balloon in Edina. I just want some flexibility. I want the city council to revisit the topic on a regular basis. But some of the issues like parking, the size of a lot, I don't know whether that's zoning or whether that's building regulation or how our land use regulation, but I think the biggest thing is to keep some flexibility in this this is a plan. This is a 10-year plan and we're in future. As far as the seniors go, yeah, some of it's going to be senior affordable housing or and there's some maybe by reducing some of the building requirements, we can make some of the units affordable that way as opposed to deep subsidies or higher density. There are other tricks to do besides just pumping lots of government money into something. So I just think that, at least for me, don't say everybody wants to keep the zoning as is, but to revisit the subject on a regular basis based on changes in tastes and preferences. Just as we talked yesterday about people renting a new construction detached house, that's a new trend. On the other hand, those houses might all go up for sale in 5 years from now if the economics change or tastes change. So just the flexibility, that's what I'm looking for so we can do stuff.
Steve, you had a comment?
Well, it is now 4 minutes to 9, and I think we're about ready to end. And before that happened, I just wanted to say I sent out some charts last night. I realized after the fact that I'd missed a chart, which is the chart for multifamily owned properties. Everything that you've looked at is going to be for multifamily rental properties. So I'll send that chart out for you to have as well, and you can think about that and just send any comments back via email. I think Norm's got his hand up, but
Norm,
I think he's on mute.
I'll unmute him. Norm?
Yes, I had a phone call coming in that I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh.
Having my phone ringing. Before we leave, there was a significant portion of this document, and it was the history of land use rules to segregate uses and people. And it's a couple of pages worth, and it talks about the color of law and mapping prejudice. I feel very strongly that while it certainly is accurate information, and I think we would all agree it's egregiously deplorable history, it is ancient history. And I can't imagine that there might be a few people, but hardly any people living in Edina that had anything at all to do with racial covenants. And in keeping with focusing on the positive things that we are doing, it's not clear to me that this has any place in this report.
I would argue against that, Norm, because
Well,
the
if
situation
we-
that people are living in today is directly correlated and related to covenants and restrictions that have occurred in the past. In fact, the Race and Equity Committee, the Human Rights and Relations Committee is working on, there are existing on the books something like 2,400 properties in Edina that currently have racial covenants on them. Granted, they can't be enforced, but they have in even recent history affected whether or not people have been able to move into certain neighborhoods, and it has an emotional bearing as well. There's a great video put out by some folks in Gold Valley that are addressing this issue. So there is a straight line between what has happened in the past with regards to who could move where and the situation that is being experienced today.
Are there people that are not able to purchase homes in Edina?
There is generational wealth that has made it possible for people to get an education with minimal student loans because people equity and inheritances have been passed on to them. Home ownership is a wealth building endeavor, which is why people ought to own homes. And so there are deep discrepancies on who can move into Edina and who can't based on some of this generational wealth that has related to home ownership.
I just want to make one comment I disagree with Stephanie, but that's okay. But that doesn't address what Norm's saying. If you look at the range of household incomes in Edina, and then you compare that to the range of household incomes of, say, blacks, for instance, you would think more black households would be in Edina. Money, but they don't live here. So that's a question worth asking. Why, if they could live here, they couldn't? So it's obviously not the case that there are signs at 50th in France saying you're not welcome here, but there may be a reason.
But there's also, Minnesota has the absolute worst in the nation of home ownership rates between whites and blacks.
I agree. I think you're missing my point. There are among affluent black families, okay, they're underrepresented in Edina. So the question is kind of why? I mean, it's an interesting question.
I would
I
answer
can
that
help you
question
with
by
that,
saying,
Jan.
oh, well, Janet, you go ahead.
Yeah, I can help you with that, Jan. The reason why they are not here, it's essentially their unspoken attitudes that make it really hostile for those families to be here. So it takes one with a thick skin to actually move into Edina. As I have been walking around, I know I have run into a real estate person who shared with me and said, such and such a family, they were here and they were affluent as well, but they had to leave because the environment was not conducive to their children, and that hostility made them leave. And yes, they meet the criteria you're trying to say. They are affluent and they had the money, but they made it a decision to leave because undercurrents make it hard to exist. So that's why.
I have talked to others who have wanted to move their businesses into Edina, and they've worked with real estate agents who led them to, and they're African American, and they led them to Brooklyn Park, they led them to North Minneapolis, they led them to Richfield, and they said, no, they kept saying, no, we want to move to Edina, and they're like, no, you really don't want to move to Edina, you're not welcome there. So and that happened within like the past 3 years. So there are, even though that's not legal, even though that's anecdotal, there are, that coupled with what Janet is experiencing when she's door knocking, some of this stuff is alive and well.
I would also say that there is a fear among the African American community of not being welcomed, perhaps more so for Edina because of the stereotype, right or wrong. So they don't even look at it, the city, with some of the affluent African Americans that I've known and worked with. So I think that whether or not they can legally buy a home any place in Edina if they've got the money, it's do you feel welcome? And that's another whole set of issues. Also, some people want to be someplace where there's a lot of people that kind of look like them. I mean, if you and I have been kind of in a reverse situation myself, there's a kind of like you look around for somebody that kind of looks like you once in a while, and if you don't find them, you sometimes get a little nervous. I would say that, but then again, you look at the city council race, you have 3 candidates who have an African background, whether it was 4 centuries ago or a decade or so ago. So there is a diversity going on, and interesting diversity for those of us who grew up in a place like Indiana, where it was a little tougher place race-wise. I don't agree totally, Stephanie, with the analysis about the discrepancy, because I think there's a high rate of ownership among the upper Midwest, people with deep roots in the upper Midwest, which contributes to the disparity. And a lot of, at least African Americans that I've worked with are known through my work and stuff, came up from Chicago and Indiana and places like that with less resources than a typical African American household. So I think it's a much more complex issue than just saying it's something about discrimination in Minnesota. I think that you have to look at a lot of issues. So after that, I'm finished.
Unless we have recommendations and strategies to address this, then we're putting something in that has something different to do other than the provision of housing. And I agree that there are attitudes and there are issues with real estate agents. If those are actually correct, those are issues to be solved by removing people's licenses. Not necessarily having to do with the provision of housing.
We are going to have to wrap it up. Steve, but I have a meeting, and we have passed our time. But Steve, I don't want to. You raised your hand before I said that.
That's okay. I will simply say I support Norm, what Norm is saying. I think we want to have a mention of some larger societal issues, but not turn it into a major point. So we're trying to acknowledge that we're aware of some things, but we don't have any recommendations that we think are needed to address that issue. So it's going to be a question of how much emphasis we put on some of these topics. And I think our litmus test is what Norm was saying, which is, do we have a recommendation and a strategy that we need to provide rationale for? And if we don't, then it's going to be a small point. If we do, then we need to make sure we build the case.
I would acknowledge it, but I would maybe downplay it from how much text we're giving it in the current draft.
I would say we weave in the race and equity recommendation on it because even on the vision of the city, that is one part there. Is it the vision statement? It talks about inclusivity, and yes, housing has been one of those places where we can make significant change. And yes, we do have diversity. I must say diversity that is currently existing. It's on the one section of Edina, and I mean, if you come back there, you would be proud, but can we spread it out more? That's all. So the race and equity report inclusion or reference to that might help us in these areas.
So it's 9:09. Should we let Janet have the last word and conclude our meeting?
Yes.
Well,
Great.
what's the plan for next week? Are you guys going to have a conversation? I'm going to be plowing on the report.
I think we should meet.
Me too.
Agreed.
Do you feel you should be meeting with me and Stephanie? And well, I think we.
Yeah, I
definitely
have to.
At least needs to be involved. Yeah. If it's a task force.
It's helpful to have both of you.
Okay.
Yeah. You do not need to be involved, I don't think, Merritt, but Stephanie, for public meeting reasons, do you have to be involved or otherwise?
If you guys
someone
are
else can-
meeting, I have to be involved.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it should be both of you.
Okay, well, why don't we, in advance, both Stephanie and I and you as a group, why don't we think about what would be most helpful to focus on next week? Like, where are you thinking robust discussion still needs to happen? So we don't have to decide that at the moment, but I think we should go into next week with kind of a specific plan.
I think that's great. So if all of us would think about that a little bit and email the group and say, here's some things I'd like to discuss, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Enjoy a beautiful day.
Yes. Beautiful week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
So long.
Hi.